At long last, we begin our series on Theodicy, confronting human suffering with God. Why does God permit evil to exist and prosper and the righteous to suffer? And with that, launching into our discussion, the first issue I'd like to address is to what extent there is altogether an allowance and even an obligation to seek what amount to elusive answers and not to trivialize the question. And I must admit, in this regard, besides, of course, the elementary starting point, which is the definition of theodicy, which we've already noted, the quest for a vindication of God's goodness and justice in the face of the existence of evil, we perforce launch into something that is, for many of you, old hat, because we've addressed it in the past. And this amounts to an epistemological meandering. That is the quest for a theory of knowledge, how we know what we know. Because ultimately, that is critical in recognizing just why this quest to vindicate God's goodness and justice seems, frankly, so doomed at the outset. The starting point, which is a starting point that we have employed in various other studies as well, is in Descartes. I admit that what I'm about to present as my take on Descartes may not be Descartes' take on Descartes, although I think it's a reasonable stab. When Descartes famously enunciated his principle, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, he definitely did not have any sort of syllogism in mind. If there had been any kind of syllogistic thinking, then the very invocation of I in the I think would have been unjustified because he hadn't yet established that he is. Rather, simply put, I think therefore I am is a subjective conviction. And the reason I emphasize this point, indeed, the reason that Descartes emphasized this point is there is no more foundational statement that one can make with respect to what one knows for sure. I think, therefore I am, writes Descartes, is the first and the most certain, which presents itself to whoever conducts his thoughts in order. And again, understanding this as enunciating a subjective conviction, what it amounts to is I have the subjective experience of thinking. There is necessarily a subject of that subjective experience. And I emphasize this point. I apologize for those who have already heard me make this point, perhaps over and over again, maybe ad nauseum, because what essentially it enunciates is the realization that I can have doubts with respect to everything else in my universe, but my own existence is beyond doubt. So, to put it in the most blunt of terms, can I doubt the existence of God? Yes, I can. Anyone who denies that is simply faking out himself. Can I doubt my own existence? I sure can. I can doubt your existence because you could all be figments of my imagination. But I know that I am because I have this subjective experience that I'm thinking that I am. What I am, besides being a thinker, is an impossible question to answer. Obviously, is this body real? Is the framework in which I think I exist real? Those are all, on some level, up for grabs. but that I exist as a thinker is not. And the reason that we emphasize this point relentlessly, with the realization that I cannot doubt my own existence, I can doubt your existence, I can doubt God's existence, is this imposes upon us inexorably an inherent falsity. An inherent falsity based upon what we claim to believe. That is, if we believe, as expressed in Yirmiyahu, the Hashem Elokim Emet, God the Lord is truth. God is absolute truth. As the Yerushalmi expresses it in various Midrashic sources as well, that as it were, God's seal is truth, meaning, in the Yerushalmi it is clear that God represents exclusively autonomous independent existence and nothing else does, an idea that famously is expressed by Rambam in the fourth halacha in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, the fourth halacha is the halacha code. God alone is the truth. Nothing else is true like God is true. And this is that which the Torah affirms, Ein od milvado. There's nothing besides God. Meaning, there's no true existent besides God, like God, inasmuch as only God represents unconditional existence, and everything else is conditional existence. Everything else is created by God. So we enunciate this as our conviction. But on some level, our experience necessarily contravenes that, because in our experience, the absolute is our own existence, not God's. So there is some irreducible dimension of falsity that necessarily clouds our vision. And as we've noted on many occasions, this is indeed precisely what the Torah famously articulates. When Moshe implores God, Har'eni na et kivodecha, to show him God's glory, to reveal a level of absolute that indeed is irreconcilable with being in this world. God's response, Lo tuchal lirot et panai ki lo yirani hadam b'chai. You cannot see, as it were, my face, because mankind cannot see me while alive. There is an inherent contradiction between being alive in this world and being able to grasp God. Obviously, we're not speaking of physical sight because there's nothing to see. But sight is a metaphor for understanding. And that level of understanding is necessarily elusive, inaccessible in this world, expressing it in the words of Yeshayahu. Similarly, in Yeshayahu, Isaiah chapter 55, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says God. As the heavens are high above the earth, so my ways are high above your ways, and my thoughts above your thoughts. And what ensues, inevitably, we're not going to belabor this point because we have much more on our agenda, but from wall to wall, all of the classics of Jewish thought enunciate this verity, the impossibility of being able to grasp God, beginning with Rav Saadia Gaon in the first Ma'amar of Ha'emunot V'Hadayot, the realization that to be able to have that level of comprehension would require our being creators ourselves, which obviously we are not. Likewise, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that if we would be able to apprehend the veracity of God's existence, then that would inevitably mean a deficiency in God. That is, positing that God is absolute existence necessarily precludes our being able to comprehend it. Again, in our private universe, we're the absolute. And since that's not the truth, we are compelled to view the world through the spectacles of falsity. This, of course, is likewise enunciated by Rambam in Moreh HaNebuchim, in the Guide, Unit 1, Chapter 37, that ufanai lo yera'u, which of course is the corollary of the impossibility of being able to be alive in this world and comprehend God, that my face cannot be seen, the reality of my existence as it is cannot be apprehended. And likewise, in Ilchot Teshuvah, that just as it is impossible for a human being to apprehend, to grasp the reality of God, so too it is impossible to grasp, to apprehend the mind of God. And this, of course, is precisely what flows from our starting point and why it is so crucially relevant with respect to the exercise upon which we are embarking. Famously, as enunciated by Veran Rabbeinu Nisim, and in the same words by the foremost Talmid of his foremost Talmid, Rav Yosef Albo, student of Rav Chazda Kreskes, student of Rabbeinu Nisim, Ilu Yidativ Hayitiv. In the Ran, likewise in Rav Yosef Albo, if I would know him, I would be him. I am not God. I cannot know God. So there's something that is crucially limiting in our ability to apprehend. Another way of enunciating the same idea, that when God responds to Moshe's solicitation to know God's name. So we encounter the formulation in Shmot, in Exodus chapter 3, Zeshmi le'olam, which of course in its plain meaning, this is my name forever, but forever is spelled deficiently, and in as much as it is spelled deficiently, we expound it as le'alam, to conceal, hiddenness, which on a practical plane has the expression of recognizing that God's holy name is concealed. We cannot utter the Tetragrammaton, but on a deeper level, if you will, a more pervasive plane, the realization that it means that that level of connecting with God remains beyond us. As Maharal enunciates this in Netzach Yisrael, that Amitat Shmo Yitbarach, the reality, the veracity of God's name, is something that is incompatible with the way the world functions. Our world operates on a different level because of the limitations that necessarily circumscribe us as physical beings. Perhaps going more fundamentally back to the implications of concealment, the Abarbanel in Mifalot Elokim emphasizes this point with respect to the very implication of olam. Olam, the way we refer to, as Abarbanel describes it, Klalut HaMetziut, the universe, certainly in post-biblical Hebrew. Whether in biblical Hebrew has that connotation or not, we'll know it in a moment. But that the universe is called Olam, says Abarbanel, because everything in this universe ultimately is entirely concealed. And perhaps to express this most conclusively in the terms that Rav Hirsch uses in his commentary on the Torah, where we encounter God being described as El Olam. And of course, there's this ambiguity with respect to the usage of Olam in biblical Hebrew. Does it exclusively refer to forever, elusiveness of time, or does it also refer to the universe in biblical Hebrew? Certainly in post-biblical Hebrew, it takes on that second meaning. The comments, Rav Hirsch, in Tanakh, the word olam seems not only to mean the hidden past and future, but altogether that which is hidden from our eyes, invisible to us. It is indeed presumptuous to declare that only the past and the future are hidden from us. The most actual present in truth at the bottom is an olam. Fundamentally, at rock bottom, everything concrete has its roots in the ne'elam, concealment, which really is that which has the highest degree of permanent reality. It's indeed the most permanent reality, but not in our consciousness, not in our experiential reality. Shapes, forms, change, the force, the ne'elam, the abstract that lies invisibly at the base of everything that is concrete, is permanent, is the one real thing on which one can depend. Perhaps this way of looking at it is reproduced in the idea of olam being the world. Again, whether even in biblical Hebrew, certainly in post-biblical Hebrew. For the real world is actually the olam, and it wants to accustom us to look at every occurrence beyond the actual visible to the invisible force that lies behind it, and up to God, the ruler and director of that force, the Melech HaOlam, to whose kingdom everything belongs, which surrounds us in this world of riddles. So again, this realization that there is this insurmountable limitation and our conception of reality, and perhaps the most vivid expression of this, if you will, on the level of parlance is, we know very well that in traditional Hebrew, when we speak of Olam HaEmet, the world of truth, we aren't talking about this one. We're talking about the world to come. If anything, on the contrary, in the Midrash, this world is described as Olam Dishkan, the world of falsity. And indeed, in this vein, comments Maharal on our starting point. Remember the verse in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah chapter 10, Hashem Elokim Emet, God the Lord is truth, from which the Talmud Yerushalmi derived that the seal of the Holy One Blessed be His truth, the seal of the Holy One Blessed be His truth, comments Maharal, because this attribute, the attribute of truth, is not in this world, which is the world of falsity. And as the Ismach Moshe comments on Parashat Ki Teitzah, that makes it all the more appropriate to be the seal of the Holy One Blessed be He, because it is clearly not something that can be forged, because that attribute of truth is not to be found in man. It is only the seal of the Holy One Blessed be He. And of what bearing is this with respect to our discussion of theodicy? Well, of course, the answer should be clear. It is categorically beyond our ken to be able to understand the manner in which God guides, leads, rules the universe. So how are we going to purport to understand the riddle, the enigma of theodicy? Indeed, without elaborating on this point to excess right now, Rambam, in his commentary on the final Mishnah in Tractate Berachot, makes this observation altogether with respect to the enigma of the suffering of the righteous. And what he stresses, indeed, is that there is a system of divine justice, but derech hatzedek bahem ein beichot adam nasigo. There's no way that man can apprehend that system of divine justice, just as indeed, as we already noted, it is impossible for the intellect of man to be able to encompass the mind of the Holy One, blessed be He. And Rambam notes in this regard indeed, the expression is used in other contexts, but he applies it here, that anyone who attempted to reach some kind of definitive conclusion in this matter can be likened to one who dives in deep waters and in the end, instead of coming up with pearls, just comes up with broken pottery. Because there's something that is irreducibly enigmatic here, and something that will indeed remain an enigma. So at this point, of course, you might say, well, because of all of the foregoing, we have, for all intents and purposes, already thrown out this entire project before we've even embarked upon it. So what are we doing here? And in attempting to answer that question, we should well appreciate that, on the one hand, all of the foregoing indeed should make us awfully circumspect in the entire enterprise of trying to be able to justify divine justice. Perhaps a good initial illustration of the limitation is something that Rambam enunciates. Rather than seeing the text in the guide inside, I figured it would be more efficient to just present a brief schematization of it. In the third unit of the guide, in chapter 16, Rambam tells us that the philosophers made such a horrific mistake. There is no way they can be redeemed, reestablished after this failing on their part. Of course, for those who are engaged in the Chavura in Marachim and God Perplexed, you know already that this is characteristic of the third unit of the guide, in as much as Rambam progressively from one unit to the next further impugns and casts aspersions on Aristotelian philosophy. And the third unit is unequivocally the most anti-Aristotelian. But we'll put a closed parentheses on that for our purposes at present. But Rambam goes on to elaborate in the said chapter is the argument employed by the philosophers in establishing, from their perspective, I stress, this is not Jewish philosophy, that the deity is unaware of the world of particulars. The implicit starting point of this syllogistic thinking is the proposition that the deity is perfect, absolutely lacking any deficiency. Now, having stated this, the explicit proposition inevitably is either the deity is aware of the world of particulars or is unaware of the world of particulars. Well, obviously, that's a truism. There are no additional possibilities. So considering those two alternatives, if the deity is aware of the world of particulars, argue the philosophers, states Rambam, there are three possibilities. The first, the deity orders the particulars according to the most perfect order. The second, or the deity is incapable of ordering the particulars and has no power over them. The third, the deity is able to order and govern the particulars but deliberately neglects them. Now, when one considers the fate of these three alternatives, that the deity orders the particulars according to the most perfect order is obviously contradicted by observation. That's not the world we live in. The deity is incapable of ordering the particulars and has no power over them is contradicted by the first proposition. That the deity is perfect, completely lacking in any deficiency. The deity is able to order and govern the particulars but deliberately neglects them is certainly negated by the first proposition. Because to be able to order the particulars in the most perfect order and deliberately neglect them is certainly deficient. So having then rejected these two alternatives because they are contradicted by the first proposition, having rejected this alternative because it's contradicted by observation, forces us to reach the conclusion, proven by reductio ad absurdum, that the deity is unaware of the world of particulars. This is the argument of the philosophers. Rambam, again, says this is so grievous an error that there is no getting up after the fall that thereby results. Okay, so we recognize the philosophers shouldn't have done that from Rambam's perspective. It's not just about the philosophers. Given everything we've said until now, how can it be that practically the get-go, Avraham in Parashat Vayera in Genesis chapter 18 indicts divine justice? That when God tells Avraham about the impending doom of Sodom and Amorah, the 5 cities of the plain, Avraham gets into a fight with God. God forbid that you should do this thing to slay the righteous with the wicked, and the righteous will be like the wicked. God forbid for you to do this. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? Now, based on everything we said until now, how can you ask the question? You purport to understand divine justice? And yet, and this is really, of course, is particularly addressing the question of whether we are empowered, even summoned, to ask the question, to seek the elusive answers, even if we're incapable of coming to them. That God, of course, makes Avraham privy to the impending doom of the cities precisely because he wants Avraham to get into a fight with him. And from the lead up to these verses, God says, am I going to cover up from Avraham that which I am doing? And the emphasis, because I have known him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they will keep the way of God to do justice and righteousness. That is, it is precisely this commitment to justice and righteousness that impels Avraham to ask the question, as indeed he should. And needless to note, the Midrash lauds him for having done so. We'll note on an additional plane, in the similar vein of getting into a fight with God, of course, Moshe gets into a fight with God over the fate of Israel in the wake of the sin of the golden calf, in the wake of the sin of the spies. And if anything, this is an idea that is in particular enunciated in Zohar literature, that the failure of Noach to similarly engage God, petition God on behalf of his contemporaries, is held as an indictment of Noach, by reason of which the flood is called Mei Noach, the waters of Noach, because he didn't do anything to prevent them. So the ability to ask the question, on some plane, the imperative to ask the question, is axiomatic in our tradition. Likewise, besides the concern that people should not be subjected to the gratuitous suffering, we find the complaint that amounts to why the wicked are being let off easily. Certainly enunciated by the prophet Jonah chapter 4, with respect to God's forbearance regarding the people of Nineveh, and perhaps even more gratingly, the words of Yirmiyahu in Jeremiah chapter 12, where on the one hand the prophet affirms, Sadiq ata Hashem, you are just God, but I'm still going to contend with you. Why is the way of the wicked successful, prosperous? Those who have dealt treacherously are in tranquility. You have planted them such that they are well rooted. They go and even produce fruit, even though You are only near their mouths, but far from their innards. And on a broader plane, we'll note the imperative of asking the question that is implicit in the contrast drawn in the Talmud between 4 verses in Tanakh. First, that Moshe in Parashat Ekev, Deuteronomy chapter 10, refers to God as Hakel Hagadol Hagibor Manara, God who is great, mighty, and awesome. Then in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah chapter 32, where we find that last attribute of awesome deleted. And Yirmiyahu refers to God as Hakel Hagadol Hagibor, God great, mighty, not awesome. Then Daniel chapter 9, referring to God as Hakel Hagadol Behanora, God who is great and awesome, but not mighty. And finally, in the formulation that we read in, well, what from our perspective is the second half of the book of Ezra, because in our canon there is no separate book of Nehemiah, but in common reckoning, it's in Nehemiah and Nehemiah chapter 9, where once again God is described as Hakel Hagadol Hagibor Hanora, God great, mighty, and awesome. And the Gemara in Tractate Yoma famously tells us that the men of the Great Assembly convened under the aegis of Ezra and Nehemiah are called the Great Assembly because they restored the crown of divine attributes to its former splendor, inasmuch as we noted, Moshe refers to God as Hakel Hagadol Hagibor Hanora. And why did Jeremiah omit referring to God as Norah? Because he had a complaint. Heathens are croaking in his sanctuary. Where is his awesomeness? So he didn't say Norah. He didn't say awesome. And Daniel, remember, Daniel omitted Gibor, mighty. Daniel, witnessing the exile, says the aliens are subjugating his children, subjugating Israel. Where is God's mightiness? So he refrained from referring to God as mighty. And the men of the Great Assembly come and say, on the contrary. It's a fascinating inversion. Essentially, what emerges from the perspective of the men of the Great Assembly when one pays careful attention to what it is that they're saying is, Yirmiyahu, you saw the nation's croaking in celebration in his sanctuary, and you questioned where is God's awesomeness. That wasn't awesomeness. That was might. This is the mightiness of God, as it were, that God has the self-restraint of being long-tempered to the wicked and allowing them to engage in the blasphemous destruction of everything that is holy. And Daniel, you observed the subjugation of Israel and questioned where's God's mightiness. That wasn't a manifestation of mightiness, that was a manifestation of awesomeness. That were it not for the awesomeness of the Holy One, blessed be He, one nation wouldn't be able to survive among the nations of the world. So bottom line, of course, the men of the Great Assembly, even if they may have been of lesser prowess than Yirmiyahu and Daniel, had, if you will, a longer range vision. They came later. And they were able to restore the crown of divine attributes to its former splendor and refer to God as we do in the formulation of the Amidah, the core of our prayer, as Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vanara, God, great, mighty, and awesome. But what's germane for our purposes is the Gemara then goes on to ask, V'Rabbanan, so these early rabbis, referring, of course, to Yirmiyahu and Daniel. How did they have the audacity to do what they did, to uproot that which Moshe had ordained? And while Moshe had established this formulation of Hakel Gadol Hagibor, to delete one or the other of these attributes, to refer to God not as mighty or not as awesome. And the Gemara presents the answer of Rabbi Elazar, which is nothing less than startling. Mitoch sheyod'im beHakadosh Baruch Hu she'amitihu levichach lo kizvu bo. They knew that God is truthful. Well, of course, that's their starting point, right? God the Lord is truth. And as a result, they didn't want to lie to him. They didn't want to lie to him. So, if referring to God as mighty, awesome, according to the bottom line in this passage in the Talmud, is tantamount to a lie, why don't we refer to the men of the Great Assembly as the men of the lying assembly? Right? Are they instituting something that is therefore to be regarded as a lie? Of course, the answer is no. Again, they had the breadth of vision that came from a vantage point of roughly 150 years later than Yirmiyahu and Daniel. They could see things that the earlier generations could not. But what's relevant for our purposes, what is indeed critical for our purposes, is to appreciate that no one is going to hold Yirmiyahu and Daniel accountable to view reality from a perspective that was essentially divorced from their reality. To ask the question, to have the problem, to have the challenge, is not only legitimate. The implication of the Gemara is it's compulsory. They knew that God is truthful. And for them to say something that was not consonant with their experience, even if their experience really was limited, they didn't see the whole picture. But to say something that wasn't consonant with their experience would have made them into liars. And as a result, they didn't say mighty, they didn't say awesome. Where obviously the implications with respect to ourselves are, on the one hand, we're not going to be modifying the canon of prayer. We're coming on the heels of the men of the Great Assembly. But the principle to ask the question is not only permissible, but obligatory, is a cardinal principle for us to assimilate into our lives as well. One final example that we'll note here, we've noted this example in other contexts as well, that when Moshe comes to Pharaoh and it's time for the plagues to be unleashed on Egypt, what in fact happens is what seems not merely to be a distraction, but a terrible travesty. The gratuitous suffering of Israel when the initial response of Pharaoh to Moshe's intercession on behalf of Israel is to deny them stubble for straw, as if they weren't suffering enough. And Moshe himself is plagued by the consequence of his having come to Paro, and things just got worse. And on some level, we appreciate that there is also an answer implicit here in the enigma of theodicy. But what I want to focus upon is simply this. The approach taken by the Midrash, is it's time for the plagues to be unleashed on Egypt. But if they are, then the rank and file Egyptians will have a complaint. It's not fair. After all, Pharaoh sinned. We're innocent. Why are we suffering? And that implicit complaint was enough to stop the plagues in their tracks. So they didn't begin, except now there's no stubble for straw. And the Torah tells us, the people had to scatter over all the land of Egypt in order to find stubble for straw. And the rhetorical question, it's so hard to find stubble. After the harvest, the fields are full of stubble. No one wants it, no one needs it. It's completely valueless. What's the problem to find stubble? And the answer the Midrash provides is because when each member of Israel would enter an Egyptian's field in order to gather the ownerless stubble that was left in the field, the Egyptian would run after him with sticks and chase him away. So they had to scatter over the entire land of Egypt just in order to find stubble for straw. And again, the flesh and blood eyes, what terrible, gratuitous, and unnecessary suffering. So that even Moshe is broken by it. But from a divine perspective, remember what was holding back the plagues? This complaint. Pharaoh sinned, why should we be suffering? Now you're all guilty. Because of that extra dose of torment that the rank and file Egyptians provided to the hapless slaves, now they are all worthy of punishment, and now the plagues will be unleashed in all of their fury. And why am I mentioning this? Simply for this reason, that implicit complaint, even though it hadn't yet been articulated, but the implicit complaint that the plagues would be an affront to divine justice, we wouldn't relate to that implicit complaint as, what do you understand from the way God governs the world? No, there was enough to stop the plagues in their tracks until the Egyptians indeed became culpable, which implies that even on that level, on, if you will, the most bankrupt level of the Egyptians trying to exonerate themselves and escape the consequences of the plagues, on some level, asking the question, is divine justice just? Is legitimate. It may even be obligatory. So, inevitably at this juncture, we ask ourselves, so how does this work? Remember, the whole spate of the sources with which we began enunciated the inescapable verity that we have no comprehension of God, no comprehension of God's mind, no comprehension of the manner in which God runs the world, and by consequence, inevitably, no comprehension of indeed why the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. So why ask the question? But we do ask the question. And asking the question, as all of the latter set of sources that we've seen enunciates, is not only acceptable, it's even enjoined. On some level, it's required of us to ask these questions. So, how does this compute? On what basis, then, do we altogether even strive to ask this question? Recognizing the truth in this world is in the realm of the divine and completely eludes our understanding. And this perforce compels us to consider another midrashic source. I know this is another midrash that I have a tendency to dwell upon because it is so fraught with meaning, not only in our understanding this world, but in our understanding what we understand in this world, in the whole quest for a functional epistemology for dealing with this world. The midrash juxtaposes a number of verses, in particular, with respect to truth, in Daniel chapter 8, the expression "Vatashlech emet arza." Truth is cast down to the earth. And conversely, the implication in Psalm 85, emet me'eretz titzmach, truth sprouts up from the earth. Says the Midrash, when the Holy One, blessed be He, came to create Adam, the ministering angels became bands and factions. Among them, those who were saying man should not be created. Among them, those saying he should be created. And it is in this vein that the Midrash cites the preceding verse in Psalm 85, Chesed ve'emet nifgashu, tzedek ve'shalom nashaku. Kindness and truth meet, justice, righteousness, and peace embrace. 4 attributes: kindness, truth, righteousness, and peace. Chesed omer yibare. Kindness is in favor of man being created. Shehu gomel chasadim, because man does acts of kindness. Ve'emet omer al yibare shekolo shkarim. And truth says man should not be created because it's all lies. Tzedek omer yibare shehu oseh tzedakot. Tzedek, again understood as righteousness, is in favor of man being created because man does acts of righteousness. Tzedakah. Shalom omer al yibare dekulei ketata. And peace. Shalom says man should not be created because man is all strife. So it looks like it's a 2-2 tie. What's the solution? So what does God do? He casts truth out of heaven to earth. And it's in this vein that we cite the verse from Daniel that describes truth as being cast down to earth. So the ministering angels say for the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, why are you disdaining your scepter? After all, as we noted at the outset, the seal of the Holy One, blessed be He, is truth. That truth rise up from the earth. And this is that which is written, truth sprouts up from the earth. Wow, what a midrash. So I always like to note the comment of the Ba'alei Musar, the ethicists. Why is it that God breaks the tie by throwing truth out of heaven? Why doesn't He just throw peace out of heaven? After all, they're both against the creation of man, right? And the ready answer has nothing to do with the 2-2 tie. As long as truth is in heaven saying man is a lie, man can never be created. By the barometer of heavenly truth, man's creation can never be justified. You need a different barometer. You need terrestrial truth. And the difference between heavenly truth and terrestrial truth is that heavenly truth is absolute. Terrestrial truth is not. It's something that sprouts, that grows, that develops. Why altogether, from the perspective of heavenly truth, is man unworthy of being created? What, he's all lies? People never say the truth? They're always lying? And of course, at this point, the answer should be clear. Obviously, it doesn't mean that people go around lying all the time, but rather that the essential epistemology of man is predicated upon falsity. Because again, cogito ergo sum. I see all of reality in terms of myself. From my perspective, there's one absolute, and absolute is me. But that's not real. So I am compelled to see reality in a warped, skewed, ultimately false manner. That's man is all lies. Inescapably so. There's nothing to do with whether people are morally bankrupt and go around lying or not. Even a person who is maximally committed to truth can only be committed to his own subjective truth, because that's all he's got as long as he is in this world. And that's tantamount from the perspective of heavenly truth to man being all lies. And for the record, that's also the reason that Shalom, peace, says man is all strife. What? Man is all strife? We're always fighting with one another? It's not a matter of always fighting with one another. There can be no shalom as long as we all occupy our own subjective reality. My reality is not your reality. There may be various aspects of consensus, but ultimately, if reality is subjective, our realities will always be distinct and disparate, and there will always be a negation of that utmost level of shalom. That strife is inevitable, in as much as truth for each and every one of us is subjective. So the solution is to cast truth out of heaven. The truth that will be relevant for the human condition is not heavenly truth. It's terrestrial truth. It is not absolute truth. It is a truth that grows incrementally. Isn't that, after all, why kindness and righteousness are in favor of man being created? Because kindness and righteousness don't gauge man in terms of some kind of absolute barometer. Kindness says he does acts of kindness incrementally. He did one more act of kindness today. That's one more reason to justify man being created. Righteousness says you do one more act of righteousness that justifies man being created. It's incremental. Well, once truth is cast to earth, truth is also incremental. It's subjective truth. Subjective truth does not mean I believe whatever I please. It's not an opinion. It is rather recognizing that as long as I am circumscribed by the reality of being in this world, that's the only truth I've got. And it's the only truth that's relevant to me. And ironically, it's fortunate that that's the case, because if we would be living in a world of absolute truth is like an on-off switch. Until you get to the truth, you're in absolute falsity. Once you flip the switch, life is finished. You have nothing else to do. But when truth is subjective, it's not an on-off switch. It's kind of like a dimmer dial with infinite gradations. Every day you are summoned to grow in truth, because truth is growing. Again, truth is sprouting up from the earth. That is the truth that is germane to the human condition. That is the truth that will justify man being created. The truth that will justify man being created is necessarily the subjective terrestrial truth, rather than the heavenly absolute. And it is indeed on that plane that we understand the continuation of the Midrash. The Midrash goes on to tell us, Me'od hu Adam. Man is very is an adverb. That doesn't make any sense. Very what? And of course, inevitably, the answer is very whatever you want to be. Whatever man is, you're very. Because it's all subjective, and it's all incremental, and it's all a process, and every step is significant. And indeed, the bottom line of the Midrash, as long as the ministering angels were arguing over this, God creates man and says, what are you arguing? Man is already created. Meaning, this debate doesn't end with the creation of man. It's a kind of ongoing process. And why is this germane with respect to our grappling with the question, striving to come up with elusive answers to this enigma of theodicy? Because the goal is not to come up with some transcendent answer. The goal is, let's just plod along, putting, so to speak, one foot in front of the other, growing incrementally. That's what life in this world is all about. If we ask ourselves, how is it possible, when truth is so elusive, for us to be striving to understand God's governance of the world. Well, our striving, of course, needs to be taken in context. It's all within this quest for subjective truth, a subjective truth that sprouts from the earth. To get an additional sense of this, we consider the thrust of the exposition in the Gemara and Tractate Sanhedrin on the last two verses of Proverbs, particularly the next to last verse, Sheker Achen Behevel Hayofi. Grace is false, beauty is vanity. The woman who is God-fearing, she is to be praised. And to what does this refer? Says the Gemara. First answer, grace is false refers to the generation of Moshe. Beauty is vanity refers to the generation of Yehoshua. The woman who is God-fearing is to be praised. This refers to the generation of Chizkiah. Chizkiah? What's going on? And what's even more perplexing is, then there's another exposition. Sheker Achen Ze Dorosh Moshe v'Yehoshua. The alternative exposition is that grace is false refers to both the generation of Moshe and Yehoshua. Hevel Hayofi, beauty is vanity, that refers to the generation of Chizkiah. So which is this? Is the generation of Chizkiah laudable or not? Yirat Hashem hiti talal. The one who is God-fearing is to be praised, refers to the generation of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli. And what was so special about the generation of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli? Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli lives at the time of the Hadrianic decrees. Study of Torah was mortal peril. The Gemara tells us, they said about the generation of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, 6 students would cover themselves in one talit and study Torah. Whether that means that they didn't have enough money to be able to buy clothing, or that they were so bone thin that one talit would suffice for 6 students, you get the sense of what was involved here. It's not a matter of some corpus of accomplishments. It's a matter of striving. The generation of Chizkiyahu, coming in particular in the wake of the reign of Achaz, at a time that the land of Israel is being overrun by the Assyrian Empire, and nonetheless striving to master even the subtleties of the laws of purity and defilement, as the Talmud tells us. That was striving to get at the truth. It's not a matter of a corpus of accomplishment. It's a matter of a struggle. But you know, if the generation of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli was even more assiduously engaged in that struggle, it's all relative. So relative to the generation of Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, the generation of Chizkiah is demoted from the woman who's God-fearing is to be praised to beauty is vanity, because you always have to keep on striving harder and harder, further and further, because you're never finished. I recall once hearing the proposition that when the Talmud tells us in Tractate Sukkah that when Yonatan ben Uziel was engaged in his study of Torah, any bird that flew over him immediately was incinerated. What does that mean? Well, we have a statement in Tractate Brachot that perhaps we can link to this. Ein uf el Torah, that the bird is an allusion, metaphorically, to Torah thoughts. In the ferocity of Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel's study, he would generate ideas in such rapid succession that he would incinerate one thought in the fervor of the next. In other words, it's always growing and it's never done. And that's precisely what life needs to always be all about. As we read in the 4th chapter of Avot, in most versions of the Mishnah, this is a Mishnah of Rabbi Yaakov. This world resembles a coward on the way to the world to come. That's not to imply that this world is inconsequential, but rather this is a world where you need to keep on moving. You don't sit down. And it is precisely in this vein that the next statement, a moment of repentance and good deeds in this world, is better than all of life in the world to come. Even as a moment of bliss in the world to come is better than all of life in this world. Is that a contradiction? Can one small portion of A be greater than B and one small portion of B be greater than A? It's not a contradiction. It's two different gauges. This world is the world of becoming. The world to come is the world of being. That's why it's the world of truth. This world is the world of becoming. That's why it's the world of falsity. And the only truth that's relevant in this world is the truth that sprouts. It's constantly growing, constantly striving, constantly struggling. In this world, that striving, repentance, and good deeds is so precious. There is nothing in the world to come commensurate with the becoming that you can do in this world. Just as there's nothing on the level of being in this world that can be commensurate with being on even the most minimal level in the world to come. And it's in this vein that the Talmud tells us at the end of Tractate Brachot, at the end of a number of other sections in Talmud, at the end of Tractate Moed Katan as well, that we draw a crucial distinction between when you take leave of someone who is still alive. Never say, Lech bit shalom, go in peace. Because go in peace implies resting in peace. And as long as someone is alive, it's always Lech le shalom. Go toward peace. Keep on going. Keep on growing. Keep on striving. You're never finished. The only time we say Lech bit shalom is when we're parting from someone who's being buried in the cemetery. Because then it really is rest in peace. We pray that having come to the end of this worldly sojourn, he has indeed attained that level of shalom. But as long as you're alive in this world, never stop striving. So, apropos of the agenda with which we began, are we allowed, even obligated, to seek the elusive answers to this question of theodicy? Unequivocally. Because we're going to get to the answers? Well, I hate to be a spoiler at the outset, but the answer is going to inevitably be no. We're not going to get to the answer, which will remain an enigma. But we have quite a journey ahead of us. Because again, truth isn't an on-off switch. It's a dimmer dial. And we're going to do our utmost to keep on increasing the level of illumination, notch by notch, even as we remain in a world of impenetrable darkness. So I hope everyone here is ready for the long haul as we embark on a fascinating journey to increase the light and get closer to that elusive goal of truth that will indeed perforce remain elusive.